So welcome everyone. This is Dr. Jamie with the Institute for Creative Mindfulness, and my special guest today is ICM team member, clinician, EMDR consultant, faculty member, Adam O'Brien. Welcome, Adam.
Why, thank you, Jamie. Thank you for having me and everybody else.
So unlike as was initially advertised, this is not a live cast. This will be on recording. However, I will be asking of Adam a lot of the questions that I have seen come up, specifically in the EMDR groups, but also in some of the other recovery groups, about our topic of focus today, which is psychedelic integration, and just kind of anything you've been curious to ask about therapeutic use of psychedelics. And if you still have a question that you feel has been unasked, or unanswered rather, we'd ask you to go ahead and note it in the comment section. And then at some point here over the next couple days or weeks, Adam will go back through and try to answer whatever didn't get answered on this short chat of ours. But I do recommend you listen through the whole way and see what's revealed. So Adam, when I hear about therapeutic use of psychedelics, my images automatically go to Richard Alpert and Timothy Leary at Harvard getting high with their students. And even though I think that's what brought therapeutic use of psychedelics into a lot of our consciousness as helpers, a lot has evolved from there. So let's start with some of the basics by asking the question, how would you describe psychedelics in the first place, even before we get into talking about their therapeutic use?
Sure. Categorically, it fall under hallucinogenics, that the psychedelic term came out of because producing apparently hallucinations. So the hallucinogens, I think the categories has been broadened more as the chemical aspect of it has kind of broadened, meaning that like manufactured, LSD, mescaline, MDMA, as you know, from the 50s kind of on, the 40s and 50s on, the categorical, step away from the more traditional of like peyote or ayahuasca that had been used for centuries, all within that same categorization, but with the more chemical, they've also added like dissociatives as a form, and like ketamine falls under that. So the hallucinogens produce kind of more vision type of experiences, which, I think, as EMDR therapists gives us a window into kind of some of the material that comes up when you take a hallucinogen, where a dissociative, you may be, separated from the pack, so to speak. But traditionally the psychedelics, hallucinogens, and mescaline, peyote, mushroom, psilocybin, MDMA, LSD, DMT, ayahuasca, if I didn't say that just then, but yeah.
So as you mentioned, psychedelics are nothing new. I mean, the 20th century brought about interest in researching them for therapeutic purposes, yet familiar to many of us is the medicinal shamanic use of ayahuasca that has certainly predated modern psychology. It's a very ancient shamanic practice. And even Ram Dass's story, who was Richard Alpert and then became Ram Dass when he followed the path of yoga, one of his quests that led him to India was to find out, what is this stuff really that we've been experimenting with and that I've become very fascinated with. And his teacher, Neem Karoli Baba or Maharaji, had revealed to him, yogis have known about this stuff for years, in the plants and the meadows and the fields. And his famous line to Ram Dass was, these kind of things get you into the room with Christ, but you can't stay. And that's then when Ram Dass really started diving more into meditation and yoga as the path, although there's a lot of people who do swear by both, right? The use of hallucinogens together with practices like meditation, yoga, EMDR, which we're of course very interested in.
Mhm.
So, I mean, the essential question here is, do psychedelics, and I think this is an area of controversy and debate, especially in the recovery community, is there a place for psychedelics in the healing process? Or because it's an artificial chemical, could you potentially be asking for more trouble? Like, is it as something that someone could become addicted to? So let's just start with some of the general viewpoints around that
Mhm.
debate.
Sure. Well, I think there are chemicals, but they're all derivative of what happens naturally in nature. So LSD is a form of ergot mold. Um, so that has its derivative and found in nature.
Mm-hmm.
DMT, ayahuasca, psilocybin. These things all have their plant based.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you take a grain alcohol versus 151 Bacardi, the farther you get away from the drug, the more potency you have. And the more potential for danger and abuse. I think there's always a potential for abusing a drug because it has to do with the relationship that the individual has to the drug. But it also offers the opportunity for um, that relationship to be exposed as to where is that need coming from.
Mm-hmm.
So within the recovery community, understandably, there's a caution there, but this isn't new to the recovery community. As Bill Wilson had done some of the earliest studies with in Canada, was introduced to LSD in I think the early 50s and wanted to bring it to the meetings because he
Mm-hmm.
saw the spiritual potential for it to help people kind of break through for that spiritual awakening like he had, of which
Mm-hmm.
was under the influence of belladonna, which is an ancient form of hallucinogen from the Greeks,
Mm-hmm.
from what I remember. And it's in the big book as far as that belladonna reference. So inducing,
And for those of you not familiar, Bill Wilson is the co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. And this is kind of a bit of a history Adam is getting at that a lot of people who are purists often don't like to reference, yet it is a part of AA history that Bill Wilson thought there was something here.
right, right, and there were cautions against it, kind of. And then the 60s happened, and it was, Timothy Leary saying, drop in, drop out and everything. But
Tune
getting
in,
into
drop out. Yep.
right.
Something like that. Yeah.
And, so the late 50s when they were, Bill was kind of, positioning this, and, cooler heads prevailed. But I think the modern renaissance that is going now is they're not just talking about set and setting in a contextual, like we did in the 60s. They're also adding skill. And the
Mm-hmm.
skills that we're talking about are, very similar to resourcing in phase two, because it's an inward journey that people are having, which I think are needed to access the healing. And that's kind of where my thinking is. And I remember had talking to you on a consultation and being like, I have to do a lot to bring up my stuff
Mm-hmm.
as a person in long-term recovery. And does this help bring my stuff up in any real time? So the use of psychedelics with addictions, I think, offer the opportunity for people to connect, where the drug may have taken away that bridge over the years. It may be part of what that needs to happen in order for them to get that aspect of self or that emotional self back online, and to be able to work with it. Uh, Understandably, I think it's a good conversation. It's not going to be right for everybody within the recovery community. But it does offer the opportunity to address the relationship that the individual is creating to the experience or to the drug, and to address it. Otherwise, it's kind of avoiding it when you are not addressing it, whether you need to do it with a drug or not. I think everybody in early recovery at some point crosses a line between, do I have a healthy relationship with sex? Do I have a healthy relationship with food? Do I have a healthy
Mm-hmm.
relationship with sugar or work? I think it's just another extension of the substitution, that in early recovery, you have to change that relationship to the drug anyway.
Mm-hmm. So use of psychedelics was not part of my using history. I don't have direct experience. Yet what I can reflect is having talked to individuals I've worked with, individuals who I know in recovery, individuals who I know in the trauma community, who in sharing their lived experience with me have sworn that having an ayahuasca experience, having a ketamine experience, doing something psychedelic has provided that missing link that they were just not able to find.
Mhm.
And it reminds me of what Neem Karoli Baba told Ram Dass: it's good for beginners who maybe need to get over that hump. And so I've definitely kept more of an open mind to it, especially because data is showing some compelling arguments for how especially ketamine can be used to
Mhm.
get people over this hump of connection. Um, Tell me just your feelings on that. Like is should it be more of a one or two time thing, or is it something people would have to continue to do? Because I think where I get concerned, Adam, is in a lot of conscious communities I hang out in, I hear people talking about doing ayahuasca ceremonies like 4 or 5 times a year. And
Mhm.
I'm almost hearing in some of that lived experience where they're becoming dependent on the ceremony.
Right.
So this is where I can kind of feel stuck, that I definitely think there's some value, but I think just about anything outside of our core self can become a
Yeah.
dependence. So
Yeah,
anything you want to share
absolutely.
on that?
But I'm going to answer that, but I'm also going to kind of put out there also that cannabis is a hallucinogenic,
Sure.
categorically. So I did forget to say that one. But important to this, I think that the extension is happening um, for medicinal type of uses. uh, I struggle to kind of understand, and I ask myself this question. I don't know what the difference between taking a low dose of like a microdose, which is a very subcortical dose of like LSD or any drug,
Mm-hmm.
really. I don't know how that's much different than taking a Prozac to help the chemical
Mm-hmm.
either produce more serotonin or,
Mm-hmm.
you know, um, so I think that this has
Yeah.
been going on for a while, pharmacologically, but I remember when I was, doing in my active use when hallucinogens was much more of my story. Um, I never thought of taking a subcortical dose. Like I
Mm-hmm.
thought that was like, wow, that's a pretty interesting idea.
So I want to go with that because like you said,
Yep.
hallucinogens were a part of your addiction story, but
Yeah,
you have also used them therapeutically for yourself. So
correct.
what do you see as the difference? Because you're in long-term recovery. What do you see as the difference?
Well, for me, personally, it was being able to access that world, and somewhat of I think, of a practical nature. Time and busy life and stuff like that. Um, I think that it's a journey inward. So if you take the conscious community that you're referring to,
Hmm.
people go on meditation retreats for how many times a year? I think
Sure.
people can get addicted in a sense
Oh
to
yeah.
that too. So again, it's our individual relationship to it. Yeah, I think there are like good practices that are kind of good measure for self-care, like doing a fast, like go a year without doing it.
Hmm.
Or if you are microdosing, there's supposed to be like a certain amount of days in between, and following the protocol. It's not meant to be. Alan Watts similarly kind of said, like once you get the message, hang up the phone. um, I when I extend that understanding of what he's saying, and what Alpert was kind of referring to too, and but when I go to, some people may need more of a microdosing medication management, and something that's more plant derivative, that has kind of stood the test of time for human beings, I think is more attractive to people, and they're willing to do something along that line than they are willing to
Hmm.
take like a Prozac. But I don't know
Yeah.
if taking the chemical is any chemical, Prozac versus like a microdose of LSD. There's a similar theory here that like if we boost some serotonin, it's going to be helpful.
Right.
the nice thing about certain psychedelics, I think for the most part, all of them, they turn off what is known in the brain as the default mode network. And that is, to me, like the inner critic.
Mm,
And when people have that conscious, conscientious kind of like kind of talking at them to stop doing something or whatever, when that gets quiet, people are like, oh, wow, I'm okay. I'm a
yeah.
nice person. And that is there's a relief there when that voice, in a sense, gets turned down or turned off that is attractive to people. And I think if people get addicted to the good feeling, it's also, they get addicted to not having that voice there. But I think therapeutically, if you're working with somebody who can, understand the dissociative nature of what we're accessing, that's great therapeutic value there.
Mhm.
A lot has been lost by not having this as a therapeutic tool from, the MDMA of the in the early 80s for couples work, and since the 60s there's a great potential to have people access their world and break through into the unconscious from the conscious brain. um,
So how can it
but
be
still.
done in potentially the most adaptive, helpful way possible? So for instance, you offer a service called psychedelic integration
Mhm.
in your therapy practice. So tell us what you do with that with your folks.
Staying within the legal bounds,
Yeah,
the I don't provide psychedelic sessions.
right.
I decided to put myself out there as this because I do believe in their potential, and I think it's a crime against history to have made it illegal, or at least to a professional population in a profession that it's a microscope. It's like taking that away from a chemist.
Hmm.
Um, so the pre and post is kind of really the skill that we want to be teaching people who are utilizing these. Not promoting it and not condoning it either is actually, and it's, to me, it's more of a prevention of, to be able to help use to do a conscientious and mature use of these drugs. There's no
Yeah.
tradition being passed down.
Hmm.
If through our culture to be able to access these worlds, it is kind of frat boyish in its way, and it's secretive, and it is
Hmm.
um, and it's abused that way. And my story definitely speaks to that. Uh, if I had somebody showing me the guidance and the tool of it, and if there was somebody who was willing to have this conversation with me, what is a mature use of it? It may have been a different story, because
Hmm.
psychedelic was my first intake of a drug, um, because there was such a wonder to it and its kind of connection to the ancient healing practices. Um, I think, though, that as we as we kind of go forward, the psychedelic integration, helping people to prepare and to land and to integrate, is really what that's what that service is about. It's not about providing the service.
Right.
Uh, since I've put myself out there, I mean, I've been having these conversations for a long time with people who are in addiction treatment. We don't talk too much about hallucinogenics. We talk about their drug of choice that brought them down. It's usually not hallucinogenics.
Hmm.
They have a very low potential for addiction chemically. They don't get physically dependent upon that, like alcohol or opiates.
Hmm.
Um, and so using it as a therapeutic tool it's a safer risk. Um, but the preparing people and helping them land and integrate the material and applying what they brought back,
Hmm.
um, is kind of key. And I think, again, EMDR therapists have that opportunity if they're willing to work with people, because almost when I did kind of talk about it with a lot of my clients, they were like, yeah, well, yeah, I tried that, and I don't know if it would ever have come up any other way
Hmm.
over
Yeah.
time. Um, but that's why the training that is coming out in April
Right.
is helping EMDR therapists see how you can help um, do the pre and post with people, and it's, future templates and, resourcing, and not necessarily depending on the reprocessing, because there are traumas that happen, unfortunately, in these communities as well,
Yeah.
that it can be accessed with EMDR particularly.
Well, and I imagine having a guided psychedelic experience, which, like you said, you don't provide the experience itself, but you help people with the integration of it. I could see where it would have value in people who we might refer to as being severely blocked from going into their internal world. Yet I've loved what you're doing, because I remember when you were under consultation with me, this was one of the first questions you asked, like, should I put myself out there as doing this? And I'm like, I'm glad you are, because I think the interest and the research interest, especially in using psychedelics for therapeutic purposes with recovery issues with PTSD, is not going away. Nor do I think it should, because I'm all about us finding out what's really going to work for people. But I mean, I think it's not just with this, but almost anything we put out there. Are we helping people to integrate it, using your word, or use it in the service of their recovery in the healthiest possible way? So I know a question we get specifically in a lot of the EMDR groups is ketamine specifically, because it seems like a lot of clients are able to get ketamine treatments
Mhm.
at this point. So do you have any specific insight on kind of the combination of EMDR with ketamine treatments?
Sure. So depending on the clinic that people are going to, I mean, this is more of the widely used dissociative slash hallucinogenic that is going to allow people to go to another part of the mind or ego state.
Mm-hmm.
So the the research is pretty clear on it, and that's why the FDA is, it's been downgraded to Schedule 3, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think part of our position within the medical community who is applying this is psychologically preparing the person to be able to know what might come up, doing a dissociative screening on them, to be able to see if there are underlying memories that may crop up. I mean, we probably have all heard this in one way or another. A client of mine who presented as DID just by taking the intake at 50 plus years old. So, I mean, the client may not know of all the material there. So if as psychological professionals, we hopefully can do some screening before we give them a ketamine, depending on the clinic. I'm assuming that's a part of it. But I think most of them are taking like a more of a medical model approach.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Most people that I've worked with that have dissociative disorder to, on the spectrum of DDNOS to DID, have taken a hallucinogenic at some point in their life.
Mm-hmm.
So they, in a sense, they're prepared for what might come up. But I'm assuming that having that screening be in place would be an important role for us.
Mm-hmm.
I think ketamine offers, and really any psychedelic offers, kind of the non-reality to become a reality, so you can get perspective on your current reality. It allows you to kind of be the outside observer looking at your depression or looking at your anxiety. And I think it helps build bridges to, oh, I do this because this. Whether or not it is like a cognitive answer, I think it's more of a felt answer, because that cognitive brain is really turned off in that process, and it's more of a feeling body. More other hallucinogens like MDMA produce much more empathy and much more of that feeling sense, but people are at a loss for words when they're on a psychedelic, is because they're in a feeling state, and so it helps remove that block from people who can't, in a sense, go there or get there. But in use with EMDR, to me, parts work would be a way of introducing what might come up in this process. We typically suggest not popping through the amnesia barrier with our therapy, and I think the psychedelic, even ketamine, could produce that. So having the person, if you know of a client who is going into that, if you haven't already, I would set up the meeting area dissociative table type of thing, because I think that's a good way of seeing who might show up unexpectedly when you are under the influence of drug and it's kind of too late. And it may be a big
Mhm.
surprise, which may be a welcoming, or it may be, a huge danger and kind of a more protective part that was laying dormant, or something like that.
Mhm.
Um, and then that and not necessarily doing any of the reprocessing while they are undergoing it. It's usually a limited set number of sessions that people have to go through.
Mhm.
Um, if people are invested in ketamine in their treatment, but they still want to have some therapeutic support while they go through it, having an understanding as the clinician as to, like, okay, what they may experience, is the material, what themes do I hear, start jotting down negative cognitions that are coming up, and then when that treatment is over, seeing where they're at, checking with the memories, that are, where are they at now, before kind of doing
Mhm.
reprocessing. I think that there is the potential for trauma resolution, and that conversation is probably a much bigger one than this. But the resolution of traumas and the kind of shamanistic tradition of, like, finding those lost aspects of self through time and
Mhm.
space, uh, when we take a drug to go there, we can actually bring parts of ourselves back.
Sure.
And so I think that's why the meeting area is a good home base to have them to come home
Mhm.
to. And the the reprocessing can wait, and probably a couple of weeks after, or just kind of client led as to whether or not they have to at this time, or like waiting a couple of weeks. I just feel like there's too much potential for uh, the ketamine or whatever psychedelic, um, to be doing the reprocessing then. The other question that has come up is, like, should I work on it with their microdosing? Microdosing isn't going to me produce the opportunity too much of
Mhm.
trauma resolution. So I think that is fair, but just not the day of.
Sure. And I mean, I appreciate you're not a medical doctor, so what I'm about to ask you should not be construed as medical advice. However, as a clinician who has helped people through this and who is pretty knowledgeable about this, do you think there's one particular psychedelic that holds the most potential? Or is it really like when we're talking about psychiatric drugs, it just depends on the person? Like, is it ketamine? Is it MDMA? Should we be looking more at ayahuasca? Like, what do you have
Mm,
a jury opinion on that issue?
yes, but it is going to be client specific. I
Okay.
think there are certain people who may be in the more masculine, or people who may be in the more feminine. So you may want to balance it out. Ayahuasca is considered like the godmother, and peyote is considered the godfather. So if
Mm,
somebody has, if they're way too kind of cognitive, you may want to have more of the feminine, kind of balance
hmm.
them out, the feminine energy, and
Okay.
then vice versa. Um, for kind of more maybe OCD type of presentations where control is important, or, like, life and death. LSD, I think, because it turns off that default mode network pretty quickly.
Hmm.
Um, that is, I think, a good pairing. People who need to connect emotionally, ayahuasca, I think, and those types of ayahuasca and that type of felt sense, MDMA, that can help bring about those things.
Hmm.
I think that there's a psychological pairing that, through experience, to me, I kind of have a rough template. The reality of it is, I think cannabis is really going to be offer the opportunity for people to do test drives, but also
Hmm.
do some of the deeper work. Because it's more legal, and it does offer the same intention, if the person sets it, and it turns off the default mode network. It does those things, and it may be considered a lighter, a lighter of the hallucinogens, because you can't get as high as like DMT, which can,
Mhm.
send you into another plane. But it can similarly bring you there, because to me, what it's doing is the brain is a pharmacy.
Mhm.
So all of those things are being released on some level,
Mhm.
at some time, depending on the setting and the skill of a guide,
Yeah.
and of the journeyer.
Yeah.
But I think realistically, yeah, people test driving it with a guide, can offer a lot of more, if people want to go through therapeutically what drug may pair off with them psychologically. I think what I kind of outlined can do that. Um, then there's kind of like situations like where, like heroin addiction, and I'll probably say this wrong because I've heard it pronounced a bunch of different ways, but ibogaine, particularly for heroin, the African root, hallucinogenic. So there are certain cases where um, certain drugs will produce certain effects, where another one wouldn't. I feel like
Right.
ayahuasca is like a nice, safe, warm womb,
Mhm.
um, whereas LSD is like an intellectual firework.
Mm. Mhm.
you know,
Well, as you can tell, if you're listening to this interview, Adam is quite knowledgeable on this, and I highly recommend his services if you're an EMDR therapist wanting to consult on the integration. And Adam, you have an EMDRIA approved advanced topics training coming up in April, as you said, on EMDR and psychedelic integration. So, what can people expect from that course?
I hope I didn't give too much of it away, but I think I did a crash course here today.
Yeah.
But there's more, I think, to kind of be able to screen. I want to be able to present, um, addiction as dissociation model that we are working on,
Hmm.
um, give contextualization for people working with people with addictions, and potentially the use of psychedelics. There's more skill building, there's more kind of ways of assessing,
Hmm.
and somewhat of setting up a business, or intensives. I think EMDR therapists, this is their territory. If they're going deep inward into people's psyches,
Yeah.
and the memory banks, where you're already doing a lot of what is going to be coming up or working with. So I think it has
Correct.
a great potential to have a good marriage.
Yeah, when I've talked to some of my buddies in some of these conscious communities about what ayahuasca's brought up for them and their lived experiences with it, a lot of it feels like the journeying I've been able to do with EMDR therapy, to be honest. So I like that you're really promoting that idea that so much of what you're doing as EMDR therapy is already there, and there could just be a lot of really good collaboration. So Adam, always a pleasure talking to you. I'll make sure that I post your information in the notes to this video. And yes, I highly recommend Adam, as I said, as a consultant on this matter. And I, for one, am looking very forward to the course.
Great.